quarterly labor force survey remains unchanged for the fourth quarter of 2019. This is according to Statistician-General Risenga Maluleke, who released the statistics earlier on today. This means that unemployment remains unchanged at 29.1%, the highest in 11 years. This is the first time since 2008 that the unemployment rate has not decreased in the fourth quarter. Maluleke also mentioned the retail and manufacturing sectors have shared most jobs in the fourth quarter of 2019. Now, to make sense of the numbers, I'm joined in the studio by Sifiso Skenjana, Chief Economist at IQ Business. Sifiso, it's good to have you with us.
Always great to be here.
I mean, essentially what it means in the fourth quarter, 3.3 million young people between the ages of 15 and 24 were not in employment, were not in education, they were not in training. And we saw, of course, for the first time in a very long time, since 2008, those numbers not moving. Because generally around December, people, kind of get them peace jobs and those type of things. They tend to improve and look a little bit better. What does that tell us?
Sure. It certainly tells of a terribly grim picture. Primarily because if you look at the parts of the economy that shared jobs, is usually the part that generates jobs in December, right? Retail and manufacturing.
Yeah.
And so for them to be sharing jobs close to 200,000 combined is certainly problematic. And you also look at where the jobs were gained. Those were mostly community services, and that's around, some refuse disposal.
Right.
And, and so that.
So utilities. So you're seeing about 14,000 jobs, services. Seeing about 12,000 jobs. And sporting, recreation and utilities, getting rid of waste. I mean, that's where the jobs are created.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, right, it really speaks to then understanding the true challenges of the economy. And as I've said before, that the economy creates jobs for the labor force we wish we had and not for the labor force we currently have. And I'll say it over again. And that's specifically because, again, you see services has continued to become a larger contributor to GDP, and I think now they contribute close to 23% of GDP. Yet the skills component they tend to need is largely kind of skilled and a little bit of semi-skilled. Yet 3/4 of our labor force is unskilled. And so already all the spaces that are able to absorb the kind of labor force we have are under increasing amount of pressure. And as we saw with the retail numbers, in terms of the unemployment there is showing a lot of distress. We saw, again, even the Black Friday numbers not coming out as strong as expected. Yeah. We saw now factory output numbers down 5.2%. And so the real engines of growth in the economy are under a lot of pressure right now. And also, despite the unemployment number not getting worse or not even improving, we see that there's a growth in the number of people who've become discouraged. Yeah. And so the extended definition of unemployment now has gone to 38.7. That's a 20 bips increase from previous numbers.
Yeah. What's also interesting for me was that those figures are indicating that irrespective of education level, the young people in particular are still unemployed, right? One person was making a joke saying, I have this degree up for sale, never been used. I mean, they've got a degree, it's never been used. It doesn't matter what level of education they have.
I mean, so the numbers certainly do change by education level, but at the same time, we're just seeing too many people who are, qualified from an education point of view still without degrees. And I think that's what, I think it really talks to the structure of the economy in terms of businesses not being able to absorb junior staff, and they'd rather sweat more of the assets that they currently have. And, I always say, look at South Africa, the numbers of hours worked. We rank number 5 in the world in terms of hours worked per week, right? Which means that, we are a working population in terms of really putting in the hours, and productivity, employee productivity in South Africa has increased by quite a bit over the same years, which means, again, I think is that employees now are working for, doing more for each rand that they're generating for the companies that they're working. And so, which then, as you said, then continues to close out the market for the young people. And with an unemployment rate of 58%, 58.2%, 58.1% exactly, that's a real social risk into the system.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, probably now something that really needs to go into crisis mode.
Let's look at some of the areas that have added some jobs, transport as well as the finance sector. Some monetary intervention. I mean, what is happening in the finance sector? We were actually looking at construction to have added more jobs, but obviously we are not spending as much as we should be spending on infrastructure. But there is some kind of jobs created in the financial sector.
Yeah, so I mean, the financial sector is quite an interesting one because there's financial intermediary, which is, I guess, between banks, and so banks act as financial intermediaries. And so at a time when, for example, stokvels have more activity in December, some of the macros, for example, in the country close out just for stokvels, and so there's a lot of movement of, I think, of financial assets around that time of the year, and already that also goes into things like, for example, preparing the economy for January, which is back to school and all of that stuff. So there's a lot of activity that goes into marketing financial solutions, which is either a loan or whatever. And so that's also not surprising because we know that that industry tends to gear up for December as well as January. And so that's probably one of the kind of the key contributors of the jobs growth that we saw in the financial sector.
All right. And what is actually happening here in terms of manufacturing? Why are we seeing that dip, 39K? They're talking about production processes and they're talking about printing and service activities related jobs. They're dropping.
So, we are seeing more digital intensity, right? And therefore, the likes of, I'll use the company Jetlines, all of those companies are starting to close their branches because people don't physically go and print, and a lot of the things are going via email. Now you can do digital signatures, etc. And so already that's a market that's going under increasing amount of pressure. And so, and then you look at other spaces within manufacturing. We've got 1% of our exporters account for 70% of our exports.
Yeah.
And by design, that means we've got deep concentration in those markets. And if you look at our export competitiveness over the years, it's weakened. Yet our import intensity has increased. And that's just the number of things we need to import to satisfy domestic demand. And therefore, it's all of those things around the loss of competitiveness in our export space when the global market is moving around us and we're just not catching up fast enough.
We're not improving also in our employment of women. Black African women still remaining rather vulnerable in that whole number. You're looking at 30% of them actually being the ones who are hardest hit.
Yeah, so it's actually 31% of women in terms of the unemployment rate for them. And if you look at black South Africans, it's 32%, right? And so already it talks around the equity and structural issues that are embedded in the economy. And interestingly enough, if you look at all the stats that have been studied on employee productivity, it's actually shown that women are better managers than men. And so it actually is counterproductive to have this disjoint or kind of the bias more heavily way towards women being unemployed. And I think it's certainly some of the things that need to be tightened up in terms of the Employment Equity Act, as well as then the legislative framework around that to ensure that compliance takes place at the right level. And this is why I always say is that sometimes we want to put all the blame on government, but corporate is also not coming into the game in terms of the role that they need to play in terms of pay parity, race pay parity, as well as gender pay parity, as well as the skills conversation, including the unemployment issue.
Right. Agriculture. I mean, we saw some recording of some jobs. The 6,000 jobs is not as high as one would expect to be in that particular sector. Does it have anything to do with issues of policy uncertainty, particularly with, of course, Section 25 being amended, or at least hearings going on right now about the amendment of Section 25? I
think policy uncertainty will always have a stymieing effect on investment and the level of of investment, but I think we also need to, unbundle the agriculture conversation, because not all agriculture is created equal. And so from 1996, we had 1.6 million people employed in agriculture. Now we've got 885,000 people. But a portion in agriculture, horticulture, has actually been job accretive, right? And so there have been jobs growing there in horticulture, but some of the field crops are coming under increasing amount of pressure from droughts and late farmings and all of that stuff that's really now putting pressure on some of those people. And so I think the horticultural space remains quite competitive space for South Africa. We are the number 1 exporter of citrus in the world, and number 2 exporter of macadamia nuts. So there are portions of agriculture that are starting to show good value, and then the portions of agriculture that I think are coming under increasing amount of stress. And so when we start to unbundle that conversation, I think we'll have a more textured view around how to respond to the agricultural needs of the economy. But as I said, yes, absolutely, policy uncertainty does stymie the level of investment that you'll see into the sector.
It must be discouraging, though, for the president, with all the interventions that he has tried, including your investment summit, your job summit, and getting all stakeholders on board, to find that he actually has not moved the needle at all when it comes to employment. And are you surprised by the fact that with all those interventions, nothing has actually happened?
No, so the interventions would not see success absent a structural reform of the economy. And so what portions of the economy are generating value? And so that's the first thing that needs to happen is for us to really go back and say, once we understand that certain parts of the economy have high velocity of money. When I talk about high velocity of money, I'll take an example, tourism. The amount of money you can spend in marketing an event in tourism. For example, the Roger Federer and Nadal game, right? 200,000 people wanted to go to the game and only 50,000 could go. And the tickets were, going for north of 1,000 rand. Yeah. And that has an impact on the local economy in Cape Town, for the flights, for hospitality, and so that's also a sector that can absorb people who are lowly skilled. And so while you are building the institutional framework that can in the long term increase aggregate output and absorb labor, you've got to also look for quick wins. And they're not necessarily paper fires, but it's also just sectors that are able to move capital quickly into being able to absorb people into the job market.
Sifiso, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming through. Sifiso Skenjana, Chief Economist, there, helping us make a sense of the numbers today as they come out. Fourth quarter unemployment figures, sitting pretty much unchanged, flat at 29.1%.